So in the last video, we set up the relationships between all of our models, and that's a very important foundational step to do. But after that, we still need a way to query the data and render it on our views. So in Rails, it's a very heavily MVC pattern. So we did the modeling already, and next we're going to move on to the controllers, and then finally the views. So to hook everything up, we need to still render our data the way we want to, and that's where the controllers come into play. We can go ahead and work on our discussions controller to start with. And since we scaffolded this, it's pretty much done for us. But we do have some work to do for authentication. Typically, when I want to create a discussion, at least for this app, I don't want a user to not be, I want them to be logged in no matter what. So we can just authenticate user with a bang, comma, and then you can run this parameter that says accept on the show view and index view. So actually we'll do index first. So on those views only, you don't have to be authenticated, otherwise you do. So that makes sense. And then instead of the default stuff that's here, we need to kind of tweak this to work for us. And instead of discussions.all, I'll just do discussions.all the order, and then created at and descending. And I will need access to our channels on our index view, since the index of this controller is our root path now. So we need to access the channels. We can do that by channel, all, same thing basically, order, created at, sending. Cool. And then we'll also need access to that on our show page as well. So we can do the same thing. I'll just type it out, but it's the same as what was in index. And pretty much the same for channels. And notice it's plural in the names. That's important because we're going to loop through all of them. On the new one, we do need to pass through specific stuff tailor fit to devise, and a new discussion is going to look for the current user and access the discussions, and then do a method called build, which is another way of saying, hey, it's going to create them. You can look up the build command if you want to get an in-depth view of what that really entails. Channel to all. We also access all the channels on the new page as well. So that is actually within the form. There's a drop down for each channel. So we need access to those. You'll see once we get to the views. And then on edit, we need channels as well. You notice I keep repeating this. I could probably just do a before action on most of these. I didn't do that in my demo app, but I probably could. So maybe I'll do that. Down here, there's private methods. We could do set channel, or let's say find channels. And we'll do at channels equals channel dot all dot order, created at, descending. And then up here we could do a before action find channels, and then only index show let's see, new, where else, edit. I think that's it. So with that done, we can just basically do this and get rid of some of that code. It's a lot drier, not repeating ourselves, which is important. So in edit, we don't need anything in that case. Cool. So on create, we still need to pass in the same thing as we said before. So current user dot discussions, plural, and then build, and then pass in our discussion parameters. Okay, cool. So we'll save that. We've got our discussions controller done. Move to our channels controller. So let's go over there. And this one might be a little bit different. We're still finding all the channels, which is great. It's not a huge deal that we do this. We could authenticate, but I'm going to make it to where only an admin can actually basically create a channel. So I'm going to just leave it be. We do need to find the discussions on the index. And we're just going to get all of them. So on the show, it's going to be a conditional query where we're going to find discussion where the channel ID matches the channel's actual ID. So on our discussion table, we have a column called channel ID, and we want those IDs to match. If you remember, we created the migration in a previous video, and that's where that comes into play. So if those IDs match up, then that means they correspond and relate to each other. So kind of technical, but kind of makes sense at the same time. So, and we just need to query through all the channels as well. So we can just do channel.all. If you want to order those like the rest we have been, you certainly can. Not a huge deal if not. I don't need a channel to belong to a user of any type. I have it set up to do so, but I realize I really don't need that because just an admin level user is going to create it. Maybe further down the line, I would do the same. Just hook it into Devise. We could do that now even. It's not a big deal. But I'm going to go ahead and just withstand from doing that right now. Feel free to do that yourself. It shouldn't change anything, I don't think, as you're chugging along here. So one thing I want to do though is when I create a new channel is redirect to the actual channel's path. So it's going to show the root index path of the channel. It just kind of lists all the channels in that sense. Rather than go to the channel show page, I don't really need to see the channel itself. So let's see, we want to redirect to the same page here. So channel path. Cool. So that one was fairly simple. The main one here that we really need is on the show page of a channel. We want to find the discussion where the channel matches the ID of the channel itself, or of the discussion ID matches the channel ID. That's the channels controller. I think that's about it. We do need to create a replies controller. Since I didn't scaffold that one out, we still need to create that one by hand. So I'm going to do that. Underscore controller. And this one might get a little complicated, and it's simply because we're nesting a route, but we're also digging into the kind of crazy relationship going on. So bear with me. I'll try to explain it the best I can. But we're going to create a class that inherits from application controller, like most classes, controller classes. And going to be quite a few before actions here. First, we're going to authenticate the user pretty much for everything. And let's see. Before action, we're going to set the reply. I guess I did scaffold this in the other demo app, but that's okay. I can kind of speed through it. So we're setting it, basically finding the reply for each of these views. So basically it lends us a hand so we don't have to type that, find it by params each time. I'm going to do the same for discussion. And we're going to do only create, edit, show, update, destroy. That I probably should have wrote that completely backwards and said except, let's see, new, but hey, whatever. Okay. So while I'm at it, I'm going to create those private methods. So at the very bottom will be this, and we can do set discussion. And we'll find the discussion on the reply. So we'll do that by, instead just the ID, we need to pass in the discussion ID, which is on the discussion itself. And then set reply will be the params ID one. So let's hook that in. At reply equals reply dot find params ID. And then we can create one more that is the strong parameters, which we'll use here in a second. Params dot require reply. If you didn't scaffold this, I'd recommend like typing it out. It seems that you take the scaffold for granted sometimes and you forget what these things actually are, and sometimes just typing them makes all the difference. I learn best when I type out the code. I know it's time consuming and kind of mind numbing, but it tends to work pretty well in terms of remembering things. I'm rambling. I'm in the create action now. We need to find the reply that's on the discussion, which we're finding below through the discussion ID. And we're going to do the replies create method. And we're passing in params of the reply. And we're permitting it. As well as the discussion ID. So this is allowing us to create a reply within the discussion, if that makes sense. And this one line is kind of helping us do that. We also need to save the user ID to the reply so that we know who created it. So I added a user ID column to the reply. I'm going to make that equal to the current user ID. Makes sense, hopefully. That's kind of probably one of the more complicated parts of the app right there. So don't worry if it's not 100% clear. It's just kind of, you're trying to think of a blog comment. So you're trying to create a new record within another record inside that model. And it's just kind of doing things a little back-asswards, but it works. So what I want to do is, if the reply is saved, we're going to render a format .html. It's going to redirect to discussion path, and then we're going to pass in the discussion, which is grabbing the discussion ID again. So it's again coming down here and finding this that's being put into that. Kind of complicated, I know. For this specific reply, I'm going to do some JavaScript that makes it a little more dynamic. So when you create a reply, it's going to use this file here to inject our reply into the page instead of doing a full page reload. So it's kind of the Rails Ajax way of doing things. It's kind of neat. We'll get into that in a second once I finish this controller and get started on the views. So redirect to same thing. And then I want to pass in a notice here if it didn't save. So if there's an error, we need to just say something happened. And we also need format JS. So this cool thing about responding to after something's saved here, we could just, it could be HTML, you can leave out the JS and just forget about it, or you can do JSON and render JSON, however you want to do. And there's a cool thing called Json Builder, which you can add into your views, and it's just kind of nifty. You'll see it in your scaffold, and it more or less creates a nice looking JSON array of all of your stuff. It's kind of useful for like front end apps and frameworks, like JavaScript frameworks, if you're doing something like that. So in that, this needs to be an else. I wrote in too early there. All right, so that's the create method. Kind of complicated, I know. So the def new is just literally that. We're already passing in everything else there. So we don't need to do much there. Destroy is another story. So destroy. We'll do reply equals discussion replies that find params ID, and then take that reply and destroy it. And then after it's destroy, redirect to discussion path again and pass in the discussion. Okay, and edit. Typically, I don't know, on a blog comment kind of thing, you probably wouldn't want the user to be able to edit, but in this case I do, because on a forum, typically you're going to write a longer response, I think, just based on your knowledge of something. Or not. Sometimes it's just short and sweet. But so one thing we'll have to take into account is a gem I installed. I'll come back to this. I think we'll be able to do it without. But we'll be typing this thing called friendly here, and it makes our URLs pretty. And it's kind of just a nice gem to have, so your URLs are memorable instead of just ID numbers. So maybe we'll come back to that. And reply equals discussion dot replies dot find params. So here an edit, to be able to edit, I need to find the discussion we're dealing with, and then taking that discussion, the reply, we're going to use the discussion that we found up here, find the replies on it, and then find the one with the associated ID that we're editing, if that makes sense. So the parameters is finding the ID and the URL. If that isn't clear yet, it's probably not 100%, but it took me a while to figure that stuff out. So don't fear if you haven't. All right, this one's going to look a little bit like create, but we'll just do this. And then respond to do. And then for each one, we'll do a format. Make sure to end it. And then if at reply dot update, we pass in the reply params, which are below, right there. We can do an end there, or actually it'll be a else and then an end. So if, we'll format HTML and pass in redirect, discussion path again. And then notice, this is just kind of good user experience. Reply was successfully updated. Cool. And then else we'll do format HTML, render edit. So if something goes wrong, we're just going to render the actual edit form again. And then format JSON. This is just here. I don't necessarily need it, but up to you if you want. So if you were to scaffold this, like I was mentioning, Rails would kind of just add that stuff by default. It's just doing you a hand. I think that's it for this one. It's kind of complicated, like I said, but I think all in all, it's taking shape. We're going to come back to this to figure out our friendly IDs, which we'll do on a couple of these places, specifically on the edit path, because that's going to make use of the ID to find of the URL to find the right reply we're looking for. So I think that's the replies model or controller. So I think that takes care of our controllers. Okay, so in the very next video, I'm going to begin on working on the views, and we'll start taking shape and getting actually some actual data on the page, so this stuff starts to make a little more sense to you, hopefully. So apologies if it's been a lot of a cram session so far, but I want to get the data underway before we really dive into the view, because otherwise things will not work and they'll kind of break. We needed to set our relationships first and then get all of our interactivity going on the controllers, and then we'll be all set. Forgot a spelling error there. But I'll double check my work here, and then we'll move on to the views in the next few videos.